In the city where billionaires ruled from glass towers and every heartbeat seemed tied to the rise and fall of the stock market, Arthur Vance believed he had seen everything: power, greed, weakness. He thought he understood the price of every human choice, until, on an icy afternoon, a boy no older than 12 stole his phone and vanished into the maze of forgotten streets. Arthur expected a petty thief. What he found instead shattered him, because inside that phone lived the last remnants of a life he had lost. And the boy who stole it wasn't running from the law. He was running from death itself. As Arthur followed the signal deeper into the shadows, he had no idea he was about to uncover a truth that would rip open old wounds and force him to confront the one ghost his billions could never bury. In the heart of a city that never slept, a place where fortunes were made and lost with the daily ringing of the stock market bell, lived a man who had mastered the game. Arthur Vance was a name whispered with a mixture of awe and envy in boardrooms and exclusive clubs. He was a billionaire, a titan of industry whose personal wealth was a staggering collection of assets, from sprawling real estate to a diversified portfolio of stocks and cryptocurrencies that fluctuated by millions with every tick of the market. His life was a fortress of glass and steel, a sterile penthouse high above the gritty streets from which he commanded his empire with cold, calculated precision. He was a man insulated from the world by a mountain of money, a man who believed every problem had a price and every person a weakness to be exploited for profit. But on one unforgivingly cold afternoon, his perfectly ordered world was about to be shattered by a single, desperate act. The door of his armored limousine opened with a silent hydraulic hiss, releasing him into the crisp city air. For a fleeting moment, Arthur was just another man on the sidewalk, albeit one in a bespoke suit that cost more than the car most people drove. And in that moment of transition, from the sterile bubble of his car to the sterile lobby of his corporate tower, chaos found him. It was a blur of motion, a small, wiry figure in a threadbare hoodie, moving with the desperate speed of a cornered animal. Before Arthur's private security could even react, a hand shot out, snatched the state-of-the-art smartphone from his grasp, and was gone, vanishing into the labyrinthine alleys that were the city's veins. A jolt of pure, unadulterated rage shot through Arthur. It was the violation, the sheer audacity of it. His security team scrambled, their faces a mask of panic and apology. The protocol was clear: lockdown, police, recovery. But Arthur held up a hand, silencing them. The anger was already receding, replaced by something else, something he hadn't felt in years: intrigue. He had seen the thief's face for a split second. It wasn't the face of a hardened criminal. It was the face of a boy, a child. He dismissed the frantic apologies of his head of security. "Forget the police," he commanded, his voice low and steady. "Track the phone. I want a live feed. But do not, under any circumstances, intervene. I want to see." The command was bizarre, a deviation from the ruthless efficiency that had built his massive net worth. But Arthur wasn't interested in the phone's monetary value. The device was a drop in the ocean of his financial empire. He could buy 1,000 more without noticing the expense. No, this phone was different. It was priceless. Locked within its encrypted memory were the last vestiges of a life he had lost. A treasure more valuable than all the gold in his vaults, more precious than his entire inheritance. It held the last voice recordings of his daughter. Back in his penthouse, the city lights twinkling below like a carpet of scattered diamonds, Arthur watched a massive screen. His security team, the best money could buy, had patched him in. The phone's GPS signal was a pulsing red dot moving through the city's decaying industrial district. He expected the dot to stop at a pawn shop, a black market tech dealer. He expected to watch the boy barter his priceless memories for a handful of dollars. confirming Arthur's deeply ingrained belief that desperation always led to depravity. It was a simple transaction, the kind of raw, unfiltered capitalism he understood. But the dot didn't stop at any place of commerce. It led to a dilapidated tenement building, a crumbling brick facade that looked like it had been forgotten by time. The feed switched from a map to a grainy thermal image, then to a micro-drone's camera peering through a grimy window. Arthur leaned forward, his cold curiosity sharpening. He saw the boy, his chest heaving, slide the lock on a door and disappear inside. The room was small, barely furnished, and brutally cold. There was no celebration, no quick sale. There was only the boy, huddled in a corner, his shoulders shaking. Arthur Vance, the multimillionaire who could move global markets with a single phone call, found himself utterly transfixed. He was watching a story unfold that didn't fit any of his business models. This wasn't about profit or loss, assets or liabilities. This was something else entirely. For the next month, he would become a silent, unseen ghost in this boy's life, a spectator to a tragedy he couldn't yet comprehend. He believed he was about to witness the predictable trajectory of a common street thief. He had no idea that he was about to follow this boy down a rabbit hole of suffering and sacrifice that would not only unravel a devastating truth, but would also force Arthur to confront the one ghost his immense fortune could never exorcise. The truth he was about to see would make him panic, and in that panic he would find the shattered pieces of his own soul. The first week of this strange, self-imposed surveillance began as a study in contradictions. On Arthur's screen, the boy, whose name he did not yet know, was a ghost in his own life, moving with a quiet desperation that was almost unnerving. The dilapidated apartment was more of a cell than a home, a single room where the chill seemed to seep from the very walls. In one corner, on a mattress stained with time and hardship, lay a small, frail figure, a young girl, her breathing a shallow, ragged whisper that was a constant, harrowing soundtrack to the boy's frantic movements. This was the why. Arthur understood it instinctively. This wasn't about a quick score, a drug habit, or the thrill of petty crime. This was about survival. Arthur, a man whose entire existence was built on the predictable logic of capital and return on investment, found himself utterly baffled. The boy made no attempt to sell the phone. He didn't take it to a pawn shop or meet a shady contact in an alley. Instead, under the dim glow of a single bare bulb, he treated the device with a strange reverence. He used its powerful processor and high-speed connection not for entertainment, but for research. Arthur watched, his brow furrowed in confusion, as the boy typed complex medical terms into the search bar. Pediatric interstitial lung disease, experimental nebulizer treatments, low-cost corticosteroids. The screen, a portal into this world of poverty, showed the boy scrolling through dense medical journals and clinical trial databases, his young face etched with a concentration that would have been more at home in a university library than in this squalid room. From his penthouse, surrounded by a fortune so vast it was almost an abstraction, Arthur felt a growing sense of the absurd. The daily interest earned on just one of his many investment funds could have transformed this boy's life, could have bought him the best medical care in the world. A tiny fraction of his portfolio, a few shares from his holdings in a booming tech company, would be a life-altering windfall. He watched the boy try to decipher the complex language of medicine and felt a disquieting sense of impotence. All his wealth, all his power, all the assets listed in his sprawling financial statements were useless here. He was just a man watching a screen, a silent witness to a battle being fought with a stolen tool. Then, on the fifth day, it happened. The boy, frustrated after hours of fruitless searching, fumbled the phone. His thumb accidentally swiped across the screen, opening the audio files. A sound suddenly filled the grim silence of the apartment, a sound that made Arthur Vance's blood run cold. It was the sound of a little girl's laughter, pure, uninhibited, and achingly familiar. It was his daughter, Elizabeth. A recording from a birthday party years ago, a digital ghost he had preserved like a sacred relic. On the screen, the boy froze, his eyes wide with shock and a dawning horror. Guilt washed over his face, so palpable that Arthur could feel it through the layers of technology that separated them. The boy didn't delete it. He couldn't. He just stared at the phone, the sound of a life he'd never known, echoing in his tiny room. In his sterile penthouse, 1,000 feet above the city, Arthur felt a sharp, physical jolt, as if the sound had traveled through the screen and struck him in the chest. His carefully constructed detachment shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. This wasn't a thief. This wasn't a case study in urban decay. This boy, this desperate, frightened child, was now the unwilling guardian of the most precious piece of his shattered heart. The cold curiosity that had driven him for days began to burn with a different, more painful heat. He was no longer just watching. He was now inextricably bound to this boy's fate, tied together by the ghost of a laugh, and so the dynamic shifted. Arthur was no longer a detached observer analyzing a peculiar situation. He was a participant, bound to the scene on his screen by an invisible thread of shared grief. The boy's desperation was no longer a curiosity. It was a mirror reflecting a pain Arthur knew all too well. But just as this strange, fragile connection formed, a new and far more brutal reality was about to crash down upon the two siblings, a force of mundane cruelty that Arthur's wealth had insulated him from for decades. The next day, a hulking figure appeared at the apartment door. Arthur's drone captured the man's face in sharp detail, a sneer permanently etched into his features, eyes that held the cold, flat look of someone who saw people not as human beings, but as entries on a ledger. This was the landlord. He didn't knock. He pounded, the sound echoing through the thin walls. The boy opened the door a crack, his small frame a stark contrast to the man's imposing bulk. The landlord shoved a piece of paper into his hand, an eviction notice, final, non-negotiable. Arthur watched the boy's face crumble. The flicker of hope he'd seen when researching treatments was extinguished, replaced by the raw, primal fear of homelessness. The landlord spoke, his voice a low growl that the drone's microphone picked up with chilling clarity. He wanted them out. The building was being renovated, he claimed, and their squalid room was destined to become a studio loft for triple the rent. He was a small-time predator, motivated by a simple, ugly avarice that was a microcosm of the ruthless world of real estate investment Arthur himself had mastered on a global scale. The amount of money the landlord stood to gain was, to Arthur, less than the rounding error on his daily stock market profits. Yet for this boy, it was a death sentence. As the second week of the surveillance began, the landlord escalated his campaign of cruelty. One morning, the single bare bulb in the apartment flickered and died. The electricity was cut. That night, the radiator went cold. The heat was gone. From his climate-controlled penthouse, Arthur watched the thermal imaging on his screen shift from faint oranges and yellows to a deep, uniform blue. The biting cold of the city winter now owned the tiny room, a relentless, invisible enemy. The sister's condition worsened immediately. Her shallow breaths became ragged, punctuated by a deep, rattling cough that seemed to tear through her small body. The sound was a constant torment, a metronome counting down their final days. The boy, wrapped in every piece of clothing he owned, held her, trying to share his own meager body heat, his face a mask of helpless fury. His pride, the fierce independence that had prevented him from begging, was being ground down into dust. The stolen phone was a lifeline for research, but it couldn't buy medicine or pay the rent. He had to do something. Arthur watched as the boy reached into a loose floorboard and pulled out a small, cloth-wrapped object. It was his only possession of any value, sentimental or otherwise. He unwrapped it carefully. It was a small silver locket on a delicate chain, worn and tarnished with age. He clutched it for a long moment, his eyes squeezed shut, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. Then, with a look of grim resolve, he put on his thin jacket and left the apartment, leaving his sister sleeping under a pile of blankets. The drone followed him through the snowy streets to a pawn shop, its neon sign a garish smear of color against the grey afternoon. The transaction was swift and brutal. The pawnbroker, a man with a face as worn as the objects he traded in, barely glanced at the boy, offering a pittance for the silver. The boy took the crumpled bills without a word. The money was a temporary reprieve, enough for one dose of his sister's most critical medication, but not enough to change their fate. Before the locket disappeared into a grimy tray, Arthur had his team zoom in, capturing a high-resolution image. He felt a professional curiosity. What could this one object mean so much? When the image filled the screen in his penthouse, Arthur Vance felt the world tilt on its axis. It wasn't just any locket. The design was unique, unmistakable. A stylized silver bird, a dove with its wings outstretched. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine, a feeling he hadn't experienced since the day the doctors had given him the news about Elizabeth. He knew that design. Years ago, his late wife, Eleanor, had poured her heart into a charity she had founded to support families with critically ill children. For their annual fundraising gala, she had commissioned a limited run of these exact lockets as gifts for the highest donors. Arthur had barely paid attention, dismissing it as one of her trivial social obligations, an event that interfered with a lucrative business deal in Europe he was finalizing. He remembered her disappointment when he told her he wouldn't be there. He had soothed his guilt by making a massive donation, a sum that ensured his name was at the top of the donor list, but he hadn't given her his time. Now, staring at the image of that same locket, sold for a handful of dollars by a desperate boy who had stolen his phone, Arthur was confronted with the ghost of his own monumental failure. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a message from a past he had tried to bury under a mountain of capital and a decade of relentless work. The thread connecting him to this boy was no longer improbable. It was a chain, forged in his own forgotten history, pulling him into the heart of a storm he never saw coming. The third week began not with a bang, but with a suffocating, silent dread. For Arthur Vance, the revelation of the locket had transformed his surveillance from a morbid curiosity into a personal inquest. He had his team dig through the archives of his late wife's foundation, a part of his vast financial empire he had long ignored, treating it as a tax write-off and little more. The digital records were cold and impersonal, lists of names and donation amounts. But after hours of searching, they found it. A record from the gala 7 years ago. A modest donation made by a young couple, Elena and Marco, in honor of their newborn son. A note in the file indicated they had been gifted one of the silver dove lockets. The names meant nothing to Arthur, yet they were now seared into his mind. He had his team run a background check. The results were a short, brutal story of American hardship, a car accident, a young mother lost, a father who succumbed to grief and illness a few years later, leaving 2 children orphaned. The boy on his screen was not just a thief, he was a survivor, the last remnant of a family his wife's charity had once touched, a family Arthur himself had unknowingly brushed against and forgotten. In the frigid apartment, the small vial of medicine the locket had purchased was now empty. The brief respite it had provided was over, and the cold returned with a vengeance. The boy, Leo, spent his days and nights trying to keep his sister, Maya, warm. He would read to her from articles on the stolen phone, simplifying the complex medical language into stories of tiny warriors fighting battles inside her lungs. But stories couldn't warm her. Her cough grew deeper, a wet, rattling sound that echoed in the silence, each gasp for air a fresh stab of terror in Leo's heart. He felt his fierce pride, the only inheritance his parents had left him, cracking under the strain. He was failing her. The city outside, with its glittering towers and endless flow of capital, was a different planet. Here, in this room, there was only the cold and the sound of his sister struggling to breathe. Then, on a Tuesday night, the crisis erupted. Maya's breathing became alarmingly shallow, her lips tinged with a faint blue. A sudden, violent coughing fit seized her, and she couldn't catch her breath. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Leo's exhaustion. He slapped her back, begged her to breathe, but she was limp in his arms, her eyes wide with fear. There was no choice. The world had given him none. With trembling hands, he grabbed the billionaire's phone, the source of all his guilt and his only hope, and dialed 911. The voice of the operator was calm, distant, a lifeline from a world he didn't belong to. He stammered his address, his voice breaking as he watched his sister's chest barely rise and fall. The arrival of the paramedics was a chaotic blur of flashing lights and urgent voices. They swept into the room, their efficiency a stark contrast to the decay surrounding them. They worked on Maya, their faces grim, and in minutes they were carrying her out on a stretcher. Leo, grabbing only his jacket and the phone, followed them into the ambulance, leaving the door to their empty, frozen apartment swinging on its hinges. The emergency room was a sterile, white hell. It smelled of antiseptic and quiet desperation. Leo was adrift in a sea of beeping machines, hushed conversations, and the suffering of strangers. He was a child, alone, trying to answer questions from nurses and administrators about insurance he didn't have and a legal guardian who didn't exist. He was invisible until they wanted a signature on a form promising payment for a fortune in medical services he could never afford. Hours later, a doctor with tired eyes found him slumped in a plastic chair. The news was delivered with clinical detachment. Maya was stable for now, but her condition was far more severe than a simple respiratory infection. The doctor used long, complicated words, but the meaning was crushingly clear. It was a rare, aggressive genetic disease. It required a team of specialists, experimental treatments, and a level of care that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The doctor might as well have said it cost a mountain of gold. To Leo, the numbers were meaningless, an impossible sum that sealed their fate. Meanwhile, in his penthouse, an alert flashed across Arthur's screen. The phone had been used to make an emergency call. Its location was now fixed at City General Hospital. The game was over. The passive observation had ended. A cold knot of dread tightened in Arthur's stomach. He barked an order to his security chief. "Get me her medical file. I don't care how you do it. Use whatever resources are necessary. I want to know what this is." It was a flagrant abuse of his power, a violation of privacy that his lawyers would have screamed at. But Arthur didn't care about the legalities. He cared about the locket, the ghost of his wife's charity, and the chilling echo of a child's cough. A few hours later, a secured file appeared on his encrypted server. He clicked it open. He scrolled past the admitting information, the preliminary notes, and went straight to the specialist's initial assessment. He saw the name of the disease. The letters seemed to leap off the screen, rearranging themselves into a single, soul-shattering word from his past. The blood drained from his face, his heart hammered against his ribs. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over him, so intense he had to grip the edge of his desk to keep from falling. It was impossible. It was a cosmic joke of the cruelest kind. The diagnosis was precise, unforgiving, and identical. It was the exact same rare, aggressive genetic illness that had taken his own daughter from him. The one battle his entire net worth, his billions in assets, and all the power in the world could not win. He wasn't just watching a stranger's tragedy. He was watching his own personal nightmare play out all over again. And a raw, primal panic, the likes of which he hadn't felt in years, seized him completely. The sterile air of the penthouse suddenly felt thin, unbreathable. Arthur stumbled back from the screen, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. The panic was a physical assault, a phantom hand clutching his heart and squeezing. Years of meticulously constructed emotional walls, built with a fortune that could rival a nation's treasury, crumbled into dust. He saw not the grainy image of a stranger's child in a hospital bed, but Elizabeth, his own daughter, in her final days, her small body betrayed by the same invisible enemy. The beeping of the machines, the hushed whispers of doctors, the suffocating smell of antiseptic, it all came rushing back, a sensory ghost that his billions in assets could not exorcise. His entire life had been a testament to the power of capital. He could acquire companies, shape markets, bend the world to his will with the strategic deployment of his wealth. But in the face of this disease, his vast net worth was nothing more than a pile of useless paper. It was a cruel, cosmic mockery, and for the first time in a decade, Arthur Vance felt utterly, terrifyingly powerless. The final week of the month began with the shriek of metal on concrete. True to his word, the landlord arrived, not with a notice, but with 2 hired men. Leo was at the hospital, sitting in a waiting room. Having been told he couldn't stay by Maya's bedside without an initial payment, he couldn't make. When he returned to the apartment building, a small, miserable pile of their belongings was already on the wet pavement. The worn mattress, a box of his mother's old books, Maya's few stuffed animals, their entire world, all their earthly possessions discarded like trash. The landlord stood over the pile, a smirk on his face, the picture of petty tyranny. "Told you," he grunted, before turning and locking the door to their former home for the last time. Rain began to fall, a cold, miserable drizzle that soaked into their blankets and turned the cardboard box to pulp. Homeless, the word was a final, crushing blow. Leo stood there shivering as people walked by, their faces averted, not wanting to be tainted by his despair. He had hit the absolute bottom. There was only one thing left, one final, desperate, impossible gamble. He looked at the phone in his hand. It was no longer a tool or a stolen object. It was a symbol of the world that had crushed him. The world of the rich, the powerful, the untouchable. With a resolve born of pure desperation, he made a decision. He would return it. He would go to the owner face to face and beg. Not for money, not for a reward, but for a sliver of mercy. He found the corporate headquarters address in the phone's contact list. Vance Industries, a towering skyscraper of black glass and steel that pierced the clouds, a monument to the kind of power he couldn't even comprehend. It took him 2 hours to walk there, his clothes damp, his stomach empty. The lobby was like a cathedral built to honor money. Marble floors, soaring ceilings, and security guards in sharp suits who looked like they could break a man in half without wrinkling their ties. Leo, a small, shivering street urchin, was an immediate stain on the pristine environment. He approached the main desk, holding the phone out like a peace offering. "I need to see Mr. Vance," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I have his phone." The receptionist didn't even look at him. She nodded to a guard. 2 of them descended on him instantly. They didn't ask questions. They saw his dirty clothes, his desperate eyes, and made their judgment. They grabbed his arms, the grip like iron, and hauled him towards the revolving doors. "Get out of here, kid!" one of them snarled, shoving him so hard he stumbled and fell onto the rain-slicked plaza outside. He was thrown out, discarded just like his belongings. The world wasn't just indifferent, it was hostile. Back in the penthouse, the panic had finally subsided, burned away by the cold fire of a new and unfamiliar emotion. Rage. A rage directed not at the boy, but at the universe, at the disease, and most of all at himself. The passive observer was dead. Arthur Vance, the ruthless businessman, the master of cold calculation, was now a man on a mission. He began to move, barking orders into his secure line with a speed and ferocity that shocked his staff. He wasn't thinking about profit or loss, about stocks or dividends. He was thinking about a little girl in a hospital bed. He remembered something from the blur of his own tragedy, a doctor, a brilliant researcher who had been on the verge of a breakthrough, a new therapy that might have saved Elizabeth if they'd had more time. Dr. Alistair Finch. What had happened to him? Arthur commanded his team to find the doctor, and as they did, a second file appeared on his screen, this one from his own foundation. It was a funding report from 8 years ago, and as he read it, the last of his composure shattered. After Elizabeth's death, consumed by a grief so profound it had blotted out the sun, he had ordered his foundation to cease all funding for failed pediatric research projects. They were painful reminders of his failure. At the top of the list of defunded projects was Dr. Finch's groundbreaking work on that very disease. The money had been rerouted to build a new wing for a business school, a vanity project that had earned him praise and tax benefits. The consequences of his grief-fueled decision were staring him in the face. He hadn't just failed his own daughter, he may have condemned countless others, including Maya. The weight of it was suffocating. Without another thought, he grabbed his coat and ran for the door, his mind a maelstrom of regret and steely resolve. He raced to the hospital, arriving in the sterile, brightly lit hallway just in time to see Leo, his face streaked with tears and rain, being physically barred from entering his sister's room by a stern-faced hospital administrator demanding payment for the mounting bills. The administrator's words were a wall of bureaucratic ice. "I'm sorry, but without a down payment or proof of insurance, visiting hours are over. We have policies." She spoke to Leo, but her eyes kept flicking to the side, as if she were addressing a stain on the polished linoleum floor. Leo, small and defeated, could only stand there, his small fists clenched at his sides, the injustice of it all burning behind his eyes. He had nothing. No money, no power, nothing but the desperate love for the little girl in the room behind the door. Then a shadow fell over them. Arthur Vance moved with a quiet authority that needed no introduction. His suit was a silent testament to a world of immense capital and influence, a world where doors opened without question. The administrator's lecture faltered, her mouth hanging open for a second as she took in the man before her. She didn't know who he was, but she recognized what he was: power. She straightened up, her tone shifting, ready to address the person who clearly mattered. But Arthur didn't even glance at her. He walked past her as if she were invisible, his entire focus, his entire world, narrowing to the small, shivering boy with the tear-streaked face. He saw the defiance in Leo's eyes, a final ember of pride glowing in the ashes of his hope. He saw the exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of a child forced to carry an adult's burden. And in that moment he didn't see a thief. He saw a mirror of his own past agony. He stopped a foot away from Leo. The boy flinched, bracing himself for the inevitable accusation, the anger, the call to the police that would be the final nail in his coffin. Arthur slowly raised his hand, and Leo squeezed his eyes shut. But there was no blow. Instead, Arthur held out the smartphone, the object that had started this entire ordeal, the catalyst for so much guilt and desperation. The climax of the past month arrived not with a shout, but with a whisper. Arthur's voice was raspy, thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a decade. He didn't mention the theft. He didn't mention the weeks of surveillance or the violation. He simply asked the one question that mattered. "Tell me about your sister." The words hung in the sterile air, completely dismantling Leo's defenses. It wasn't the question he had expected, not the condemnation he was prepared for. It was an offering, an invitation, a recognition of his humanity. And with that simple, gentle query, the dam of Leo's fierce, protective pride finally broke. A ragged sob tore from his chest, a sound of pure, unadulterated anguish. The weight of the past month, the landlord, the cold, the hunger, the terror in the emergency room. It all came crashing down on him. He looked up at the billionaire, and for the first time he spoke his truth. The story poured out of him in a torrent of broken sentences and gasping breaths. He told him about Maya, about her laugh, about the way she drew pictures of sunny days even when they were freezing. He told him about their parents, about the locket that was his last connection to them, and how he had sold it for a single dose of medicine. He confessed everything, the shame of the theft mixing with the fierce, unapologetic desperation of a brother trying to save his world. Arthur listened, his face a mask of profound sorrow. He didn't interrupt. He just absorbed the boy's pain, letting it wash over him, recognizing every single wave of it. When Leo finally fell silent, exhausted and empty, Arthur knelt down, bringing himself to the boy's level. The immense difference in their net worth, in their stations in life, vanished in that moment. They were just two people, bound by a shared, unspeakable grief. "My daughter," Arthur began, his own voice cracking. "Her name was Elizabeth. She had the same laugh, the kind that could make you forget all the bad in the world." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "She had the same illness, the same fight. I had all the money in the world, a fortune that could buy anything. I hired the best doctors, funded entire hospital wings, poured every dollar of my capital into finding a cure. But it wasn't enough." He looked Leo directly in the eye, and the boy saw not a billionaire, but a fellow survivor of the same shipwreck. "I know this fight," Arthur said, his voice now steady with a terrible certainty. "I know this pain, and I know what it feels like to be completely, utterly helpless." He placed a hand on Leo's shoulder, and the gesture was not one of pity, but of solidarity. In the cold, impersonal hallway of a city hospital, two worlds had collided, and in the wreckage, they had found the one thing that transcended all the wealth and poverty that had separated them, a shared and broken heart. That moment of shared humanity, fragile and profound, hung in the air for only a heartbeat before it was shattered by the administrator clearing her throat. "Mr. Whoever you are," she began, her professional condescension returning, "this is a private matter. Hospital policy is clear regarding payment." Arthur Vance rose to his full height, the transformation in him instantaneous and absolute. The grieving father receded, replaced by the formidable billionaire, a titan of industry whose quietest whisper could shake the foundations of the stock market. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He turned his gaze on the administrator, and the sheer, unadulterated power in his eyes made her take an involuntary step back. "Policies are about to change," he said, his voice a low, chillingly calm command. "This girl, Maya, is now under my personal care. You will give her the best room, the best specialists, and you will not present this boy with another bill. Every cost from this moment forward will be directed to the Vance Foundation. Is that understood?" He pulled out his phone, not the one Leo had stolen, but a new one, and made a single call. He didn't say hello. "It's me. I am at City General Hospital. I want Dr. Alistair Finch located and on a plane here within 12 hours. I don't care where he is or what he's doing. Re-establish full, unlimited funding for his research. Effective immediately, retroactively. Double what it was before. And find the paperwork for the Vance Pediatric Wing we funded at this hospital. I want to speak with the hospital's chairman of the board in 5 minutes." He hung up. The administrator stared, her face pale, the name Vance echoing in her mind. She had just tried to enforce a billing policy on the man whose name was carved in granite on the most prestigious building in her entire institution. She stammered an apology, but Arthur had already turned his back on her, his attention once again on Leo. He knelt again. "No one will ever keep you from your sister again," he promised. The resolution was a whirlwind of activity, a display of what a truly staggering fortune could accomplish when wielded with purpose. While Maya was moved to a private suite and a team of the nation's best doctors was assembled, a different kind of army was being deployed. Arthur's legal team, a group of the most ruthless and brilliant corporate lawyers in the country, descended upon the landlord's life like a force of nature. It was a mismatch of epic proportions. The landlord, who had built his small, miserable empire on bullying the powerless, now found himself facing a legal machine designed to dismantle multinational corporations. They didn't just sue him, they performed a forensic audit of his entire life. They uncovered a decade's worth of illegal evictions, safety violations, and predatory rental agreements. His petty avarice was exposed as a pattern of criminal behavior. Within 48 hours, his assets were frozen, and he was facing a mountain of lawsuits and potential jail time. But for Arthur, this wasn't enough. Justice had to be more than punitive, it had to be restorative. While his lawyers dismantled the landlord's life, Arthur's real estate division made a quiet, all-cash offer for the dilapidated tenement building. The price was so far above market value that the shell company that officially owned the property agreed instantly, no questions asked. The entire transaction, from offer to closing, took less than a day, a testament to the sheer velocity of immense capital. A week later, Arthur Vance stood in the grimy hallway of his newest acquisition. The landlord was there, summoned under the pretense of a final inspection. He saw Arthur and sneered, not yet aware of the tectonic shift that had occurred under his feet. "What are you doing here?" he grunted. "Come to see what a real investment looks like?" Arthur looked around at the stained walls and cracked plaster, a faint cold smile on his lips. "I have," he said softly. "I've seen the conditions you force people to live in while you profit from their misery, and I've decided to make a new investment." He paused, letting the moment hang in the air. "As the new owner of this building, my first official act is to inform you that your management contract is terminated, effective immediately. Get out." The landlord's face went through a rapid series of emotions. Confusion, disbelief, dawning horror, and finally, impotent rage. He was ruined, a small-time predator devoured by a much larger one, but this time, the predator was acting on behalf of the prey. As security escorted the sputtering, furious man from the premises, Arthur turned to a waiting team of architects and contractors. "Gut it," he commanded. "Everything. I want this place transformed from a slum into a sanctuary." He then announced his plan. The building would be converted into a non-profit residence, a warm and safe haven for families who had to travel to the city for critical medical care. It would be a place of healing, a place where no one would ever have to choose between a roof over their head and their child's life. It would be named Elizabeth's House. The first residents of Elizabeth's house were, of course, Leo and his sister. The transformation of the building was a blur of efficiency that only an immense amount of capital could fuel. Walls were torn down, pipes replaced, and windows that had been clouded with decades of grime were swapped for new panes that let the sunlight stream in. What was once a symbol of urban decay became a beacon of hope. Their new apartment wasn't just a space, it was a home, crafted with a quiet, thoughtful care that went far beyond mere charity. It was warm, filled with soft furniture, and the kitchen was always stocked. Arthur had overseen every detail, not as a billionaire funding a project, but as a man trying to build the sanctuary his own daughter never had. For Leo, the change was so profound, it felt like a dream he was afraid to wake from. He no longer had to sleep with one ear open, listening to the rattling of Maya's lungs. The air in their apartment was clean, filtered by a state-of-the-art medical system. The constant gnawing anxiety in his stomach, the fear of the next bill or the landlord's next threat, was gone. He could read to Maya not to distract her from the cold, but simply for the joy of it. He watched her regain her color, her laughter slowly returning, a sound that was no longer a prelude to a coughing fit, but a pure expression of a child's happiness. Dr. Finch's clinical trial, powered by the full, unrestrained force of Arthur's financial backing, was working wonders. The doctor, a kind man with brilliant eyes, explained that Maya's case was responding better than he could have ever hoped. The disease that had once been an unstoppable monster was now in retreat, held at bay by a science that had been resurrected from the ashes of Arthur's grief. Arthur's investment was yielding dividends far more valuable than any he'd ever seen on the stock market. Each of Maya's easier breaths was a return of priceless worth. Arthur became a quiet fixture in their lives. He would visit not as a landlord or a benefactor, but as a friend. He never spoke of his vast wealth, his portfolio of stocks and bonds, or the global businesses he commanded. Instead, he would talk with Maya about her drawings and listen as Leo recounted his day at the new school Arthur had enrolled him in. He was rediscovering a part of himself he thought had died with Elizabeth, the part that knew how to simply be present, to find joy in the small, quiet moments of life. His entire net worth, his billions in dollars and assets, had bought him a world of isolation. But this boy, this girl, had given him something he could never purchase, a connection. One quiet evening, months later, the three of them were sitting in the living room. Maya, now strong enough to sit up for hours, was asleep on the couch, a peaceful smile on her face. On the small table beside her sat the smartphone, the object that had so violently woven their lives together. It had been wiped of all of Arthur's corporate data, but he had insisted Leo keep it. Leo picked it up, his fingers tracing the smooth glass. He looked at Arthur, a question in his eyes. Arthur simply nodded. Leo navigated to the audio files, his thumb hovering over the one he had accidentally played in that cold, dark room so long ago. He pressed play. Elizabeth's laugh filled the warm, safe apartment. But this time the sound was different. It wasn't a haunting echo of loss. It wasn't a stab of guilt or a reminder of a ghost. It was just a laugh, pure and beautiful. It mingled with the soft sound of Maya's steady breathing, the two sounds weaving together not as a symphony of sorrow, but as a promise. A promise that life, even after the most profound loss, could find a way to create something new and beautiful. Arthur Vance, the billionaire who had once used his fortune as a shield, felt a tear slide down his cheek. It wasn't a tear of grief, but of gratitude. He had spent years trying to conquer the world with his capital, only to discover that his greatest treasure was not in his vaults or his stock portfolio, but in the healing of a broken heart, both theirs and his own. The stolen phone had not led him to a common criminal, but to his own redemption. And in saving a family on the brink of collapse, he had finally, after a decade of wandering in the dark, begun to save himself. The change in Arthur Vance was not a sudden, dramatic spectacle, but a quiet, seismic shift in the foundation of his being. The relentless pursuit of capital, the daily analysis of stocks and bonds, the thrill of a successful business deal, it all faded into a muted background noise. His days were no longer structured by board meetings and market openings, but by Maya's physical therapy appointments and helping Leo with his homework. He discovered that the dividends paid by a child's recovering health were infinitely more valuable than any he'd ever received from his vast portfolio of investments. His wealth, once a tool for acquiring power and assets, was now a resource for creating safety and opportunity. He found a quiet joy in the mundane. He taught Leo how to ride a bike in the park, a simple rite of passage he had missed with his own daughter. He sat with Maya for hours as she drew, her pictures no longer confined to a single grimy room, but filled with bright colors depicting parks, sunny skies, and the three of them holding hands. These simple moments became the new treasures he collected, more precious than gold or any rare collectible his money could buy. He was no longer just a benefactor, he was family. One afternoon, as a new spring bloomed outside the windows of Elizabeth's house, Arthur found Leo staring at an old photograph he had brought from their former apartment. It was a faded picture of his parents, smiling, holding him as a baby. "I used to think my only job was to be strong for her," Leo said quietly, not looking up. "I thought if I ever asked for help, it meant I had failed them." Arthur sat beside him, the silence comfortable and deep. "Strength isn't about never needing help, Leo," he replied softly. "It's about knowing when to accept it. You didn't fail them. You honored them. You fought for your sister with everything you had. Your parents would be incredibly proud." In that moment, the last vestiges of Leo's guilt seemed to wash away, replaced by a quiet acceptance. He was no longer just a survivor burdened by the past, but a young man with a future, guided by a man who understood loss and had chosen to build a legacy of life from its ashes. The story of the billionaire and the street boy became a quiet legend within the walls of Elizabeth's house, a testament to the improbable ways lives can intersect. The building filled with other families, each fighting their own private battles, and they found not just a place to live, but a community built on the foundation of Arthur's rediscovered humanity. He had set out to understand the face of a common crime, expecting to find a simple story of desperation and greed. Instead, he found the reflection of his own broken heart, and in healing another's family, he finally stitched his own back together. The stolen phone had been the catalyst for a transaction far more significant than any business deal he had ever made. An exchange of despair for hope, of isolation for connection, of a fortune in dollars for a wealth of purpose that was truly priceless. If this story of compassion and second chances moved you, please show your support by giving this video a thumbs up. What do you think was the most powerful moment in Arthur's transformation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss another story that reminds us of the good in the world. Thank you for watching.